What's up, everybody? It's Eric from Trimmed and Burning, and we're learning about the Bible in a nutshell. Basically, like the historical timeline. I'm trying to explain it as if it was a movie from beginning to end to give you an idea of what's going on, and it pertains to our world today. Everything that's going on in our world today would pertain to what the Bible talks about and why things are the way they are. So let's start right from the beginning. God is before everything. God is eternal. So that means he's before space and time. Even scientists will tell you that the universe had a beginning. Now we're going to talk about the books of the Torah here, which are the first 5 books. And it starts right out here with God saying, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And because Jesus Christ is God, he was here creating the universe. The whole Trinity was there. God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit created everything out of nothing, just like science says happened. And the Bible had said this before science agreed on it. But God creates everything, space, time, matter, he creates everything here. And it included humanity, and everything was perfect until the garden. Now, Adam was the first man created, and then his wife Eve was created, and they were perfect, and God just gave them one rule, to follow his rule and to not eat the forbidden fruit. But of course they ate the forbidden fruit. They were prideful. The sin of pride is the root of all of our evil, and it's selfishness and not listening to God, doing things our way than God's way. And this is what Adam and Eve did. They chose to sin against God. They did not obey God. They sinned, and because of this, death entered the universe, and the universe was probably fractured. This is probably where the spirit world can no longer be seen anymore. But the universe was fractured, sin was here, and we were promised to die humanity, which means the DNA of humans was cursed. Everybody born from Adam and Eve is cursed in sin. But don't worry, because in Genesis 3, right here in the beginning, God promised a Messiah, Jesus Christ, because Jesus Christ was here for this whole reason. He was always the plan. And the promise of the Messiah is right here in Genesis 3, and we're going to learn that God had a plan to save humanity. So we're going to fast forward a little bit to Genesis 6. Things get worse. Now we have angels, fallen angels, spirit beings coming down, physically manifesting on the earth, and having sexual relations with women, marrying them, having children called the Nephilim. Now these Nephilim are giants that you hear about in ancient stories. They're in the Bible, the men of renown, the Nephilim. Now they were an evil bloodline. They were a mix between the spirits and humans, which was against God's code. God promised to send the Messiah through the human bloodline. But this was muddying the bloodlines here, and sin was running rampant, so God had to reset. Choose Noah, who was perfectly human and followed God, and he saved him and his family and sent a flood to basically wipe the world and wipe it clean. Start with Noah and his family, which is a total of 8 people. At this point, the environment changed. That flood wasn't like a normal flood. Waters were falling from the sky, the firmament. That would never happen again. And water was busting forth from the great deep. From above and below, water is bursting and the environment had changed. That's why after this point, nobody's living into the 1,000 years anymore, or hundreds of years anymore. The age will start to dwindle because the environment had changed. Things weren't living as longer or growing as big. Now, God had reset the earth, and it was great until Noah's great-grandson ruins it pretty much, only a few generations later. He was the one, Nimrod, to start Babel, to build the Tower of Babel. Now, this is a mockery of God. The ancient Jews believed this was to, so God couldn't flood them out again. They'd be safe up there. But more importantly, they wanted to be like God, which was Satan's problem. He wanted to be like God. The enemy wanted to be like God. It's prideful. And this was the same sin of humanity, to be our own gods and do our own thing. So God was sick of it. This was the 3rd rebellion now between the spiritual world and humanity. And God decided to split humanity up into 70 different nations. He confused them, confused their languages, and gave them over to a spirit that he called gods, that are called gods. Now, Yahweh is the one and only true God, and he created these other spirits. Think of them kind of like angels, but way more powerful. There's different rankings of spirits. Now, these 70 spirits, or gods, are ruling over the 70 nations. Now, all these nations are the Gentile nations that the Bible will talk about, and they even exist today. Any nation that's not Israel. Because after this, after the Tower of Babel, we see God call a man named Abram, who he renames Abraham. And he was a Gentile from the Gentile nations, from the Chaldeans, which refers to Babylon. So he was a Gentile that God called and said, I'm going to send the Messiah through your bloodline. He wasn't anybody perfect. He was a sinner just like you or I. But Abraham was chosen by God to start his own nation, the 71st nation, which would become Israel, which is the nation today that God promised to save humanity through. This is the Messianic bloodline. Now we learned that Abraham had a son named Isaac, and Isaac has this story, this prophetic story of the father sacrificing the son, which is pointing to Jesus Christ, that it was the plan for the Messiah to come this way. But Isaac has a son named Jacob then, which is Abraham's grandson. Jacob gets in a wrestling match with God, and he's renamed Israel. Now Israel, or Jacob, had 12 sons. These are the 12 tribes of Israel. you'll see carried out. This is the bloodline. He had 12 sons, and one of them was Joseph. Joseph was sold into slavery into Egypt, but it ended up being a blessing. He rose in rank, and the family came into Egypt, and they lived a prosperous life. God took care of them. But what had happened then is they grew from a family into a nation. They started to multiply, and Pharaoh from Egypt got a little concerned. So he turned them into slaves, and he made slaves out of them. And then this is where God called Moses. This gets to the book of Exodus. The next books, we're now out of Genesis, and now God calls Moses. We learn about this baby that was called from birth, and he ends up leaving Egypt. He was raised by Egyptians, although he was a Jew by birth, which means he's from the family of Abraham. The messianic bloodline runs through this. He was from Israel, God's chosen people. Now, this is where they become a nation. He sends Moses to save the people. Although God does miraculous things, it wasn't Moses. God sends the 10 plagues, freaks the Pharaoh out. The Pharaoh finally gives up. Although Pharaoh wouldn't let go, he basically harassed Egypt till they let him go. Pharaoh changes his mind, tries to track them down. This is where they're trapped at the Red Sea, and God parts the Red Sea with Moses. He uses Moses as a vessel, parts the Red Sea, takes him across dry land. The Egyptians die when the water comes back over, and now they're in the wilderness, and they have to wait on God. They don't have food and water, so God sends them manna and all this other really cool stuff, but the people start to grumble and complain. They don't want to go to the promised land that God sent them to because they said they had it better off than Egypt as slaves. So they grumbled, and they didn't trust in God, so God said he was going to kill this generation out. They were going to have to wander around in the wilderness, which they do for 40 years. But God promised them that they were going to go into the promised land. But even Moses is not allowed to go in the promised land. He ends up not listening to God. He strikes a rock when he was supposed to speak to it. And there's more to that story we'll cover in other videos. But basically, Moses is banned from the promised land, and Moses is at least allowed to go up onto the mountain. God allows him to go up to see the promised land from up on the mountain, but he's not allowed to go in. And this is basically the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses. It explains the origins of the Bible, the Gentile nations, those 70 nations that were given over to the 70 spirits or the 70 gods, and Israel called as being a nation. And the rest of the Bible is going to follow this bloodline, which is Jesus Christ's bloodline, the Messiah's bloodline. And this bloodline is no more perfect than you and I, other than that the Messiah came through it, and it was God's plan to save humanity. But it's Israel, God's nation, and the 70 other nations, the rest of the story, and why you and I need a Messiah. Even the Gentile nations are included. That's the beautiful thing in all this. Even those 70 disinherited nations at the Tower of Babel, we're all God's children. God is calling us to be his children, and he has sent Jesus Christ, his son, to die on the cross for you and I to be our Messiah. And it's all told here in the Torah. But up next, we're going to go into, Joshua and the history books and basically the rest of the Old Testament story that will lead up to the birth of Jesus Christ and why Jesus had to be born. And if you understand these history books coming up and this Torah here combined, you'll understand the story just like it's a movie and why Jesus Christ had to come. It's going to lead right up to his life. So tune in next time for that. Until next time, I'm Eric. Keep your lamps trimmed and burning.
Almost over. Almost over, almost